Hello, this is one of those videos that you might want to pull up a comfortable chair and a cup of tea and maybe a snack, because this will be a little longer than most of the videos I do. We're going to be discussing why the Christian faith has to be true, why the God of the Bible is certain. This week I discussed these issues with a couple skeptics, and so I'm going to read what they wrote and then I'm going to demonstrate how to refute them, because these guys were pretty intelligent, pretty sharp guys, and I've discussed the truth of Christianity with some sharp people that have some background in epistemology or philosophy, and they have similar objections, and these objections are easy to refute, easily to disprove, and it's simple to demonstrate that Christianity must be true. So we'll go off these guys. They said this: obviously an atheist would not argue that his mind is a ground of logic. He meant the laws of logic, because that's what we were discussing. Logic is not necessarily the laws of logic when you're discussing that with somebody. Logic can be predicate logic, mathematical logic, deductive logic, and so forth. I'm talking about the laws of logic, the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction. You can see my other videos if you want to learn more about those specifically. And then he goes on to say, so the atheist would not argue that his mind is a ground of logic, although that's what most atheists I've ever discussed this with have. But then he goes on to say it's probably the case that he would argue that logic is somehow intrinsic to the reality. Now another guy said, the laws of logic could be based on other things than the Christian God, certainly on things other than the Trinity or even monotheism. It would just require several sorts of errors in the worldview. Then he asked, why do the laws of logic ontologically require an infinite, eternal equality of diversity within the unity? That's what I had suggested earlier. And so my response was this. I said to these skeptics: perhaps an intelligent atheist may assert some of the connections and contentions you suggest. Yet I personally have had conversations with hundreds and hundreds of anti-theists, and they argue that the laws of logic are merely manifestations of the human brain, that the brain equals the mind for most of them. And this is what I've come across, I would say 95% of the time. And if you're an atheist and you're hearing this and that's not you, fine. I'm discussing what most of the atheists I've talked to have said. They say that the chemical reactions within the brain are what cause the laws of logic. And I'm not going to discuss how wrong-headed that is right off, excuse the pun, but I'm going to go on. That which has the ontic capacity to ground the laws of logic, that is, what has the being or the nature, what has the being or nature to ground, to account for these laws of logic? What would be the ground for the laws of logic would be incapable of error or change, while it has an eternal and infinite equality of diversity within the unity. Only triune theism reveals these attributes. So only the Christian God can bring together the laws of logic. See, there's different laws of logic. There's at least three main laws of logic. And yet, they all require one another. They all presuppose one another. They are all connected and intermingled with one another. You can't have the law of identity without the law of non-contradiction and vice versa. So they're interrelated. So there's this diversity, and yet there's a unity. And how does that, since the laws of logic are utilized in everything we say and do, this is an amazing thing. This is utterly important. Now, without such, one cannot account for them. So without God, you cannot account for these laws of logic. The laws of logic are unified yet diverse, one in application yet distinct. The law of non-contradiction is not the law of identity, yet they are unified, and one requires and presupposes the other. It's not just that the laws of logic fit into one category, but the laws of logic are interdependent upon one another. They require each other and presuppose one another and work together in perfect unison in their infinite diversity. They're utilized everywhere and everything you think and everything in the universe and beyond. That's why they're universal. A is utilized and required, and intertwined with A is not non-A. And the reverse is also true. So as these skeptics then keep on saying, well, you haven't convinced me, Again, they admit that they have not been able to account for the laws of logic. They cannot account for universals. And then they say, well, you haven't proven anything. Of course, I have proven it, and I will continue to prove it. And so I tell them, and this is what you have to remember, when you talk to somebody who's really sharp, and he's a sharp atheist, or he's just belligerent, or just doesn't care, has a hardened heart, etc., you can prove, and they'll say, well, you haven't proven anything. And you have, because they're not making a distinction between proof and persuasion. There's a difference, as Bahnsen said, between proof and persuasion. And so when you prove something and you show and demonstrate something is certain, like God's existence, and they don't want to take it, just give them the law and then the gospel and tell them how absurd and nonsensical they've been and how irrational and illogical they are, and then move on. So proof is different than persuasion. If the immutable triune God with universal reach and power and universal knowledge is not the ground for the universal, immutable, unified, in diversity laws of logic, please name what is. Of course, there's nothing in the physical universe that can be, because a particular cannot ground a universal. God has the ontic capacity to account for the laws of logic in their unified diversity. What else has immutability, universality, and an infinite diversity and unity? Now, the skeptic responded, he said this. One of them said, well, the atheist can come up with plausible reasons for it, though they often bring up other problems. Of course, once in a while an atheist may, but again, they cannot challenge these truths, because when they challenge the truths, they also must utilize those truths in their challenge. So their denial of God actually requires God to exist. Why? Because God is a ground for the laws of logic that they must use in what they're trying to deny. So remember this, though, that we know God exists, and the contrary is Bahnsen, that it is impossible. And a faithful biblical argument is not limited to just a formal argument, a theorem, or a syllogism, but it is a necessary truth revealed from above. We have this philosophy, this truth from above, and is the ground of all human experience and knowledge. And we don't have this philosophy from below. We don't have a arbitrary, man-centered philosophy, but we have one that can account for laws and universals and immutables. God lives, and he is a source of all knowledge, including the fount and the sustaining power of all the diversity within the unity that's in everything and everything we can think about and everything we can do. God lives.